This is Sirius XM Insight. You're listening to Tell Me Everything with John Fugelsang.
What a pleasure to welcome Professor Ann C. Bailey to Sirius XM Insight.
It's great to be here with you, John. Thank you for having me.
Well, thank you. And I have to say, this subject of your book might not seem like the ideal thing to discuss at Christmas, but if Christmas is at its core about humanity, then I have to praise you for writing a book with a lot of love in it. When did you first learn of this mass sell-off of humans at the Butler estate, and what was it that inspired you to devote a chunk of your life to researching it and writing it?
Well, first to your first comment, I also, when you think of a book named The Weeping Time, and of course it's called The Weeping Time because that's what the slaves on the auction block called that time. It was a time of weeping. You don't really think, you're right, of something happy, but I think the good news about the research effort and the book itself is that it starts with weeping, but it doesn't end that way. The rest of the story, as you know, is really a story of the strength and resilience of those very same black families who were sold on the auction block and how they did everything in their power in spite of the odds to find one another and to retain and reestablish those family ties. So it really, I like to think that there's a kind of a really like a curve, if you will, with this story. It's like it comes full circle in terms of these families reestablishing ties. But in terms of how I got interested through Thomas Jefferson. I heard in your intro you mentioned something about the founding fathers,
yes,
and, which is really on point, right? That we have to wrestle with the fact that the founding fathers, including Thomas Jefferson, you know, he was a slave owner. And I was fascinated, like lots of people, with his story and the story of Thomas Jefferson and Sally Hemings, the slave with whom he had multiple children. And so I was really looking to stay in touch with where was that story in the academic world, and also where was it in terms of Monticello, which is their official, historical foundation for Thomas Jefferson.
Yes.
And in looking in about 2006 or so, I'm looking at their website to see, well, now, are they acknowledging Sally's children with Thomas Jefferson? Where are we? How far have we come? Are we finally at the point where we can acknowledge that these were his children? And they were. But what was interesting is that when I read the detail on Thomas Jefferson and Sally Hemings, it says that when he died, he freed their children. But then 140 other enslaved persons were put up for auction because he was in debt. He died apparently in a huge debt.
Wow. And
that word struck me just the way it just struck you. I have seen it a million times as a scholar of slavery and history. You see this, it comes up, so-and-so was auctioned or this or that. But it never struck me as it struck me then, that what must that have meant for those families who were sold away and for whom Monticello was their home. And so from there I started looking for a case study and found this case study in Georgia, Savannah, Georgia, to be the one that I thought that I could perhaps find the most detail on, and also that could really give a sense of what it meant to have this dislocation and disconnection from family ties.
Absolutely. Now, I'm curious. I must confess, I'd heard of the sale before, the largest slave auction in America, but I must confess I never really knew much about the Butler family. Who were the Butlers, and how did they acquire their vast wealth and plantation estates?
Well, interestingly enough, the Butlers, the original Pierce Butler was one of the 55 founding fathers. So that's a little bit of a little-known fact, that he sat around the table in 1787 at the Constitutional Convention and was helping to create the Constitution as we know it. So, he was a slave owner from South Carolina. He had married into it, but then he acquired new plantations in Georgia, the Butler plantation from which these slaves come from, later on in his life. So he then passed on to his grandson, also named Pierce Butler. And that became, he really is the symbol of the plantation that I write about, because he's the one that sells the 400-plus slaves in 1859. And you can imagine that, having had such a long history of slave owning in his family, like at least 5 generations at that point, he was a staunch pro-slavery advocate. He was not someone who, questioned his privilege in any way. But curiously enough, John, he marries this English actress, Fanny Kemble, who's, an abolitionist at heart. And, the next thing you know, she's married to a man who has these plantations. They live in Philadelphia, so she's not quite sure really what that business is that he has in the South. But she soon finds out, and she wants to know more. And that becomes a real source of tension, the fact that she's an abolitionist at heart. She wants to help the slaves. She wants to do, she really wants to ameliorate their condition, and in fact thinks they should be free. And he, of course, knowing that this is the foundation of their wealth, is not willing to give an inch.
Right.
And they eventually divorce because of it.
Now, what goes into the decision to auction off 400 human beings at once? I would imagine. What was the average size of a slave auction around this time? And was it merely the size of the amount of humans being sold as property that made this particular auction unique?
It's a good question. I mean, I think the plantation itself was over 800 slaves, and Butler owned it with his brother. And so it was really half of that whole group that got sold. And again, interestingly enough, just as with the Thomas Jefferson situation, it was because of debt. So when you think about slave auctions, and that's what I wanted to be able to share with the public, that really they were as common as stock trades. And just as if now, if you own any stock, or I own any stock, and you want to, you want to pay a debt, you would cash in your stock. And I think that's why I was so intrigued by the idea of writing about an auction, because I said, how could something so common in American life drop out of American memory? Can you imagine that in 100 years, no one's ever heard of a stock trade, they'd never heard of IBM, or they'd never heard of Apple, or they'd never heard of any of these things that you can commonly buy stock on and sell stock on these days? So for me, that was what was interesting about this, was that you did these things commonly. You sold your property commonly to pay debts, or to keep yourself, in his case, to keep himself in fine style. He wanted to, he had a big, beautiful house in Philadelphia. He was a man of the arts. He just had a very luxurious life, and he wanted to keep that life going. And this was his stock, so to speak. So yes, it was not common to be selling on this level, because not everybody had this many people on their plantation, but it was very common to sell. It certainly, for the average slave, it would not be uncommon for them to have been sold several times. It really depends on the situation, but it wouldn't be uncommon. We see it in the record where some slaves are sold as many as 3 or 4 times. It really depends on the place and the situation.
And it also depended on the plantation and the plantation owner's tastes or morality, whether families would be split apart in these sales. I mean, Robert E. Lee was notorious for splitting up families, where there are records of other plantation owners being a bit more humane when it came to that sort of thing.
Very true. In fact, George Washington is a great example. It's funny that you bring that up, Robert E. Lee versus somebody like George Washington. I mean, I always say, John, that when people say, well, they're afraid that if you you look too carefully at some of the issues of who was a slave owner and who was not, that maybe we're going to throw out all our heroes. I don't think so.
Mm-hmm.
I don't think so. They're not all equal. George Washington was a nation builder, number one. He wasn't a nation destroyer,
True.
Number 2. And number 3, there are records, an excellent book by Henry Weincheck. There are records of the way in which he ran his plantation, which absolutely tended towards humanity, tended towards less selling and this kind of thing. And not only that, but prior to his death, he wrote in his will that every single slave should be freed.
Mm-hmm.
And that's something that people actually don't know. So instead of selling them, which many others did to keep the families, as rich as they always had been,
that's right,
he actually wrote that they should be freed and educated. So,
I believe John Adams did the same.
Exactly. So all these people are not the same. I think it's really worth looking. I think when people say these days, if you bring down the Confederate statues of people like Robert E. Lee and folks like that, then the next thing you know, you'll be tearing down Thomas Jefferson and you'll be tearing down George Washington. That's not true.
Exactly. Well, yes, and of course, Confederate statues are not American statues. It's a treasonous country against America, which is an argument we shouldn't have to still be making.
Exactly, but we're happy to continue making it until everybody is on board.
Facts are stubborn, immovable things. If you're just joining us, my guest is author and historian Anne C. Bailey. She's professor of history and Africana studies at SUNY Binghamton. Her new book, The Weeping Time, Memory and the Largest Slave Auction in American History, is highly acclaimed and published by Cambridge University Press. I'm always fascinated by books that actually try to bring us the real-life stories of humans who were property in this country. Our good friend Kenneth C. Davis, author of Don't Know Much About History and a regular on this program, wrote a book last year about slaves who were specifically owned by U.S. presidents. What did you learn in your exhaustive research on this 400 human being auction at the Butler Plantation Estates about the individuals? And how does one go about looking up those kind of facts? There must be very, very little out there.
There is. And I think, you really speak to such an important issue. First of all, there is very little out there that's written in part because slaves were not allowed to read and write. And so it's the rare slave that had the opportunity to learn. In fact, Fanny Kemble tried to teach a few. Butler's wife tried to teach a few of the slaves. But this was not common, and it was against the law. So you don't have a lot of written evidence, but you do have a lot of evidence from things like newspapermen. In my case, in this particular case, you had a New York newspaperman who actually went down to this auction and was recording everything he saw. He posed as a buyer, and he recorded everything that he saw and heard. So a lot of the dialogue that you see in the book, John, is actual dialogue that he recorded, of these men and women on the auction block and what it was like for them as they were trying to negotiate that space. And what do you find out about them as individuals? What you find out is that they are just regular human beings, their brothers, their mothers, their sisters, their wives, their husbands. They are trying, most of all, above all, to maintain family ties. I think that was the most striking thing to me, John, in this story, that when one was sold to one buyer, that same person tries to argue and convince that buyer to buy his family members or someone or another close member of the family or somebody that they wanted to marry or what have you, so that there's a real attempt at community. And it sometimes works, it sometimes fails, but you know that this is uppermost in their minds. And you see that throughout the historical record. And that's what I found, is that even after freedom, the first priority for them, it's really not getting political rights and the right to vote, and all those things were important, and earning a living, but number one was families first. That was a huge value system, a huge part of their value system. And I think in all the debate about black families these days, I think we don't get that positive sense. Do you know that positive sense that really there is this history of strength and resilience, and there is this history of close-knit families who meant more to each other than anything else, more than money, more than jobs, more than education. But the history's there. The history's there.
It really is a theme of your book. I don't even know if hope is an accurate word, but it is an ongoing resilience, an ongoing strength, an ongoing faith. We try to wonder, what would it be like? How would people from 21st century first world adapt to this sort of thing? And it's unimaginable, and it's one of the reasons I think that it's so vast and it's evil that we still don't take slavery seriously, which is why we still have people who fly the American swastika, the Confederate flag. Mm-hmm. But I'm curious, in your research into the families and the individuals who were sold that day, as you piece together bits of narrative and went on to meet the descendants of these unfortunate souls, what were some of the real-life slave stories that stood out for you?
Some of the stories that stood out for me, the most interesting ones were the ones in which you find the connections that they had to their African past. This area is the Gullah Geechee region, right? right? And that, for those of your listeners who may not know, Gullah Geechee is really it's an aspect of African American culture, and it's in the southern Georgia, South Carolina, Florida, and North Carolina, and it's the southernmost regions where a lot of those communities were almost isolated. You know, there were absentee landlords, and so many times they really didn't have to, you know, they were able to form some sort of tight-knit communities that wasn't always possible when you were further up in the Upper South, for example.
Right.
And these communities, just like the Butler estates, they have all these incredible traditions. So one of the main traditions is that they knew how to plant rice. So you had planters, rice planters, who made that region in the country extremely wealthy, John. In fact, historians have noted that on the eve of the Civil War, you know, some of the richest people in the country were rice planters. And they were rice planters from this region, South Carolina and Georgia. And the skills that those men and women, those enslaved men and women, brought with them from Africa, that's what made that region successful. It's not just that they were, you know, hands and feet to do the brawn, right, of field work. Not at all. There are technological skills that they learned in West and Central Africa from planting rice for hundreds of years, and they brought those skills with them to this region, and that's what made the difference. And in fact, one of the interesting things is that those landowners started to, over time, they started to self-select and only want to buy slaves from a particular region in Africa, particularly Sierra Leone and other places like that, where they knew that they knew how to plant rice. So just the fact that they brought those agricultural skills with them, and that people tend to think of agriculture, well, not everybody in the country, but some people do, as maybe slave work was just, you know, again, it's just kind of field work.
Exactly.
No, it's not. It actually is. It takes intellectual, you know, it takes intellectual understanding of how to plant, when to plant, and what skills specifically will bring you the kind of harvest that's going to make your plantation successful. And they brought that with them. The musical culture they brought with them, I think no one's surprised about that, because we know that black music is what it is. Today, all over the world, people are influenced by it. But the fact is that these are its roots, right? These are its roots. And you see that in this area in a very strong way, how strong that musical culture is, how it's always often double-coded, too. It's like it has double meanings. On one level, it's entertainment, and another level, you see slaves, particularly the boatmen, the ones who would be up and down the rivers in those areas. You see them singing songs of kind of revolutionary songs, but at the same time, they're very entertaining, they're very musical, they're like opera. All of this is coming out of this region and coming out of this period. And these are the people, these are the culture bearers that bring it up to the present, if you will. They bring it up to the present.
And you really bring this book up to the present by tracking down the descendants of these slaves to show what happened before, during, and after their sale. And I think that's one of the greatest credits to your book, because we still don't take seriously that we are living in the echoes and after effects of slavery and Jim Crow. What was it like for you to begin tracking down these folks, and how did you approach these people who might, I would guess, not have any idea their ancestors had been sold in this infamous day?
I have to say that I give a lot of credit, and I want to do that publicly, to the descendants of this auction, who I think are, especially the ones who have been on the trail themselves. In many ways, John, I feel as if I just, they've been on this journey, and I'm recording their journey. I'm helping them as a historian use the tools of history to ensure that, the I's are dotted and the T's are crossed. But essentially, they've been doing a lot of this as amateur historians themselves, and I think it's to their credit. And what I find is that in approaching them, they were, on one level, and this you might find interesting, again, this is the Gullah Geechee region, and they speak a language called Gullah. So it's like a mix of West African languages and English. And for many years, people in that region were actually ashamed of the Gullah language and ashamed that they had these little West African, Central African cultural tics, if you will, right? That there were these things about them that were distinctive. And it's only in recent years that many are now proud to be from a place that has an original African American culture, if you will. And so my wanting to interview them or to talk to them was a part of that. And I can't tell you how honored I am to just say that I could be a part of that particular part of the journey, where they could now feel as if, no, the very thing that wasn't valued in the past, people are beginning to see real value in. And indeed they are. There are Gullah festivals all over the South now. And again, you see a lot of the musical and faith tradition on display and the craft traditions on display. But that wasn't always the case. So many of these people grew up not feeling that that was something to be proud of. And my wanting to interview them and researching their history kind of gave them a signal that things were changing. On some level, things were changing in this country, and I'm kind of happy about that.
I know that in the course of your research, you asked your university library to purchase the Butler plantation papers, and you spent a great deal of time with the Historical Society of Pennsylvania. And I know how you mentioned previously in this interview that auctions at the time were almost as common as stock trades, yet most of the general public can hardly really reference any particular one, which is why I think this book is so special and so important. What would surprise 21st century Americans about slave auctions and the ritual of the slave auction?
I think if I take, for example, there are two people that come to mind when in this particular auction. Francis and Dembo, Dembo being the male and Francis being a female, both in their 20s, both from the Butler plantation. They came to the auction like everybody else, not knowing what their fate would be. But they had intended to marry. Because you see, as slaves, people, they were just regular people who, they lived and died just like the rest of us and fell in love and all the rest. And they had always hoped that they would be married. Now, the thing about the auction event is that these are not things that a slave is privy to. They don't know that, next week they could all be sold, right? Mm-hmm. So you can't make plans. And that was a very big part of how devastating the institution of slavery was, that you couldn't even make plans for the day after the next because you don't know what could happen. And
I mean, the husbands and wives would go to these not knowing if they would ever see each other again after that afternoon.
Absolutely. And in their case, they were not married, so they had no reason to think that they would be sold together. So the auction was 2 days. It's March 2nd and it's March 3rd. On March 2nd, though, they saw the process, and you had to think quickly on your feet. They saw what was going on, that they could only be sold together if they were married. And they looked amongst the crowd, and they found a minister, a Christian minister, John. And they asked him if he would marry them. He agreed to marry them. On day 2, March 3rd, they were sold together. And to me, that was one of the most poignant parts of the auction because, even though they were married, you still didn't know whether they would still be sold together, if their plan would work. But as it turns out, they did keep to that theme, that if you were married, they would, in this particular auction, we would sell you together. And so the auctioneer sold them together, and they went off to a plantation in Alabama. And the newspaper man who had recorded all this said, they literally, you would have thought they were going off, to a honeymoon, in Jamaica or something, in modern day times. I mean, they were so happy because for them this was a coup, right?
Right.
This was a coup that they actually pulled this off, that they were now going to be together, as opposed to other couples which were noted who were not going to be together because they were not married at that time. And I when I think about it, John, what would surprise you? What would surprise them? That I would think the part of what would surprise you is just the idea that real things, just the things that happened to you and I, took place for these people, but yet they were ordinary people, but in these extraordinary situations, having to think quickly, figure out what to do, figure out what's the best you can make of a very bad situation. Yeah. That's what slavery was like every day. What's the best you can make of a very bad situation? How can you resist this institution, which is fundamentally attacking things that are so important to you, such as family ties, your own personhood, and so forth? And I think to me, that's what was surprising. And what always is surprising is to see these real aspects of humanity in an inhumane institution.
Professor Bailey, before I let you go, one last question. This notorious mass slave auction took place in 1859, right on the eve of the Civil War. Were some of these people who were sold that day able, 6-7 years later, after the war, able to track down their lost loved ones and reconnect?
They sure were. And when you mention the Civil War, not only were they able to track down some of their lost loved ones, but they were able, some of them, I'm thinking of Noble and James Walker, actually fought in the war on the side of the Union Army, and bravely were able to not only say that they would receive their freedom from Lincoln and company, but that they helped to fight for their own freedom. They were active in freeing themselves. And so very much, went looking for their family members and found their family members. And a number of them I do trace all the way up to today. Some of them I lose some of them somewhere in the 20th century, but in the historical record, where you find that they stay as a family fairly close in one area or another in the South, and then their paths seem to diverge very often because there's a lot of migration going on, as you can imagine, in the 20th century. But absolutely, a significant number did find one another again, and I think in part because this was 1859 and the war was over in 1865. Mm-hmm. So there's not such a huge time depth as there would have been if, for example, they'd been sold in the 1820s. Very difficult to know whether those people who were sold in those early years would have been able to find each other and have, some of the success that at least some of my families had in this particular case.
Professor Ann C. Bailey is the author of The Weeping Time, Memory and the Largest Slave Auction in American History. What a pleasure speaking with you today. Thank you so much for joining us, and thank you for writing this book.
Same here. Thank you very much, John.
Of course.